Okay, I'm going to mostly be reading this, but I'll wing it a little bit. I love this picture. It's a wonderful picture because there he is, the universal genius, the dictator, and the mass murderer, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, standing on the forecastle of the cruiser Molotov. And you got, and all these guys are clustered behind him, very respectfully, admirals, generals, aides of one sort or another. And you got, it's like they're afraid to interrupt his momentous thoughts. What's he thinking about? Is he thinking about the great navy he's planning to build? Well, a lot of people have argued about why Stalin wanted a great navy, but historians have been unable to resolve it. Russian historians haven't figured out quite why Stalin wanted a great navy. So we Westerners aren't going to have much of a chance at it. But so I'm here today not to talk about why, but how he was going to, or how he thought he was going to build this navy, who was going to design it, who was going to build it. So plunging right in the ideologically driven top-down Soviet system, everything had to be decided at the top, anything of any importance. So Stalin's influence on naval policy wasn't limited to, high policy, who are our enemies, how big a fleet should we build. He got down into the details. He was involved in the design of warships. Everything had to be approved by Stalin. If it was a major warship, if it was a battleship, cruiser, a destroyer, even submarine classes, that he had a direct say in those ships and how those ships were designed. As the People's Commissar of the shipbuilding industry said in 1939, not a single plan of a naval vessel or of a naval gun or a great or small problem in general, not a single one of those does not pass through the hands of Comrade Stalin. He had his fingers on everything. So this raises a question. Was he competent to judge in these matters that he was responsible for? Stalin was very intelligent. He read prodigiously, and he had an extremely retentive memory. The Averell Harriman, the American ambassador, said that Stalin had an enormous ability to absorb detail. And this is supported by testimony of Soviet and of Germans who had direct dealings with him before the war. But others were not so impressed. The great rocket designer Sergei Korolev, he complained that Stalin had no idea of the problems of technology development. And I think this is a very important observation, because although Stalin could master technical details, I don't think he really understood the complexities of the overall design and construction process. One of the great ironies to my mind is that although Stalin and the Soviet leaders believed in the transformative power of industrialization, none of them, or very few of them, had really any knowledge of industry. None of them had worked in industry. None of them had been, well, a few had been engineers, but these guys didn't know how the process worked. So although he could tell you the size of guns or whatever else, whatever else he needed, muzzle velocities, armor thicknesses, he didn't know how it all came together. So what the result of this was that when things went wrong, as they inevitably had to do when you're building the first generation of ships, that when you've got a whole bunch of people who've never done it before, things went wrong. When the first Soviet-built submarine went out on trials, a lot of defects cropped up, unsurprisingly. But what was the response? The design team was arrested for sabotage, because if they're engineers, they should have known what they were doing. They should have been able to design it so that it worked perfectly right from the get-go, right? That's their job. They didn't understand. They didn't take into account the inexperience of the designers, the complexities of submarine design, and the fact that a lot of the shipyard work was just plain sloppy. And an underlying factor in all of this was that Stalin had a distrust of what the Soviets always called bourgeois specialists. That was anybody trained or educated under the old regime. So this belief that these people were actually secretly working to undermine the Soviet system fueled how he dealt with them. And it was one of the factors, one of the major factors behind the purges, which ultimately killed millions of people, because these people were working against the Soviet system, or so he thought. So that's Stalin as he An outline of the role he played. So now moving on to the Soviet shipbuilding industry. In 1928, Stalin had inaugurated the famous 5-year plans to industrialize the USSR. The focus of these plans was on heavy industry, steel production, machine building, all of these things that were related to defense, because the Soviets were convinced that the capitalist world sooner or later was going to come after them. So the 5-year plans were carried out urgently. This was a vital, something that had to be done right away, because the Soviet Union was about to be invaded by a coalition of capitalist powers at any moment. The plans were carried out at a tremendous cost in human lives, and the industries built by this process were inefficient and usually produced shoddy products. But they did produce, which was the point. Now, the shipyards and various supporting industries were included in this program. So here's a map, I hope most of you can see it, of the Soviet Union. Although it says it's a map of Soviet submarine bases or submarine yards, it applies equally well to surface ships. So what you've got here is you've got Leningrad up here, numbers 1, 2, and 3, and then you've got Nikolaev down here, number 6. Those were the traditional shipbuilding yards that dated back to Tsarist times. Stalin built 2 other major shipyards, here at Komsomolsk on the Amur River in the Far East, and up here in the far north at Molotovsk, or as it's now called, Severodvinsk. And at this shipyard, because the climatic conditions are so difficult, they built a giant shipbuilding shed that was capable of simultaneously constructing 2 60,000-ton battleships at the same time, one in each of these building ways. Yeah, it's a big place. It's still in use for building submarines. So clearly Stalin poured a lot of money into and a lot of effort into building these new shipyards and to upgrading the old shipyards. But no amount of investment could create a skilled workforce overnight. And the construction of ships was always slow. A lot of times there were problems with quality, and the supporting industries, the armaments, the steel, other industries that produced things to use to build the ships, also turned out materials slowly, sometimes badly. So the ships were often designed late, well behind schedule, and the quality wasn't always that great. And these problems persisted throughout Stalin's reign. Now, turning to the men who designed ships, and it was all men in this era, so you have to keep that in mind. The Tsarist regime had developed actually a pretty good core of naval constructors, and had some of them very innovative, and they'd done some interesting things. But a lot of those guys at the time of the Bolshevik takeover had gone into immigration. Many of them had died during the Civil War from disease or starvation. So those who were left were not trusted by the new regime, and they were sidelines into positions in research or teaching. The first generation of Soviet warships, they were not involved in building those ships. Instead, as J.N. Westwood has written, the shipbuilding program of the 1930s would be largely in the hands of naval architects and engineers who had barely started their careers in Tsarist times, together with some who, rapidly promoted under Stalin, were still schoolboys in 1917. And 10 years later, they're designing ships, 15 years later. Most of these new men had passed through the successively renamed, and I love this, Petersburg, then Petrograd, then Leningrad Polytechnical Institute. It had a shipbuilding program, but in 1930, the shipbuilding program was pulled out and became the Leningrad Shipbuilding Institute with increased class sizes. So, they were trying to train as many naval architects as they could. The training of the naval architects seems to have been pretty good, but they lacked experience. Now, to give you one example, Boris Chilikin, who was the chief constructor of the first Soviet-built battleship, or the first attempt to build a battleship, was appointed to the position of chief constructor in 1936. At that time, he was 31 years old, and he graduated from the Leningrad Polytechnical Institute only 7 or 8 years before. And this is the guy who's in charge of building the biggest ship in Soviet history, in Russian history. The first design produced under his direction is seen here. And a lot of you will probably recognize it. It's really HMS Nelson, which was admittedly the most modern battleship at the time in 1936, that the most modern battleship on which they could find any information. But you know, you look at it and it's a pretty amateurish design. I don't know about these turrets, you know, there's some funny things going on. And not only that, but the designers expected to be able to give the ship heavier armor, heavier secondary and anti-aircraft batteries, and a 9-knot increase in speed over HMS Nelson on the same displacement. And these are guys who had never designed a battleship before. So you can tell that, you know, their ambitions were bigger than their abilities. For reasons like this, the Soviets knew they needed to get foreign technical help. The most fruitful source of that, and this is always kind of surprising, was fascist Italy. Throughout the 20s and 30s, there were contacts between the Italians and the Soviets, and they not only supplied technology directly by selling them guns and fire control equipment and so forth, but they also assisted directly in Russian ship design. And several Russian naval constructors served internships in Italian yards and design offices. A group of about 20 Italian naval architects actually came to Leningrad, to help build the first Soviet cruisers. Here's a model of one. This is in the Central Naval Museum in St. Petersburg. This is the Kirov. This was designed with the assistance of Italian naval architects. And, you know, if you look at it, you could mistake it for an Italian ship. A lot of the features are very similar to Italian ships. But Italy, of course, wasn't the only source of assistance. The best Soviet submarines of the interwar years were the S-class, which were designed by the IVS firm in the Netherlands, which was actually a front for continuing German submarine technology. So these submarines, you know, were really a German designed submarine. And then after the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact was signed in August 1939, the Soviets sent delegations to Germany to pick up as much technology as they could, including, when they could, complete warships. Here's the German heavy cruiser Leutzau of the Hipper class, which was sold to the Soviet Union. And here she is being towed off to Leningrad on April 15, 1940. So they were picking up some good stuff. But these visits gave the Germans a chance to assess their Soviet colleagues at close hand. And their opinion of them was, and I quote, "They were technical experts who had done all the paper homework they could, but had no practical experience in the modern methods of ship design." And I think that's a fair statement. Another weakness of the design teams was that there weren't enough constructors. Stalin's ambitious naval building programs called for hundreds of naval constructors, and they just weren't there. So a lot of times what would happen is the Navy would go to the shipbuilding industry and say, "We want to redesign the ship. We want to change something here." And the shipbuilding industry says, "No, we don't have the capacity to do that." One of my favorites is after the war, the Shipbuilding Institute said, "We're going to continue building World War II designed ships until 1950 because we don't have enough guys to design a new generation of ships yet." Okay, so now we have to turn to the actual design process. And don't worry, I'm not going to go through this diagram in detail. This is just to give you an outline idea of what was going on, and I'll explain in a minute. The Soviet design process pretty much paralleled that in other countries, but with one major difference. In the American, British, and German navies, the design organizations were an integral part of the Navy. And so the navies trusted them when they said they could or couldn't do something. This was not the case in the Soviet system. The ships were designed by the shipbuilding industry, because in the Soviet Union, if you designed ships, you belonged in the shipbuilding industry. If you were the Navy, you belonged in the Navy. Everybody was in a separate silo depending on what they did. Now, what this led to was a great deal of friction and sometimes outright hostility between the two organizations. The Navy was convinced that industry was delivering inferior ships, while the shipbuilders thought the Navy's expectations were unrealistic. Both these points of view had a good deal of truth to them, because the Navy often was asking for the impossible, and the shipbuilders often didn't get the most they could out of the tonnage that they had to work with. So what you see here is how that process was worked out between these two separate commissariats. Here's the Navy, here's the shipbuilding industry, and each one of these arrows represents a point at which things had to be handed off from one to the other in a very bureaucratic fashion. And the ultimate design, the ultimate object here was to produce a working design, which was the design that was actually finally approved and then would be turned into the thousands of drawings needed for the final design. But as you can see, it's very bureaucratic. And what's more, several of these steps had to be approved by the government, by the Defense Committee of the People's Council, the Council of People's Commissars, excuse me. So that ultimately meant Stalin. Stalin was involved in several of these steps. Now, in the late 1930s and the late 1920s and early 30s, the design process was kind of vague. They were still sort of feeling out a system. But by the time you get to the late 1930s, you had this very bureaucratic process had been worked out. So you basically had a very set system. At the start of the process, the Navy would formulate its requirements, the desired ship's displacement, speed, armament, draft, range, the usual suspects. And in doing so, it had a small cadre of its own naval architects. And these guys would basically work out a few outline designs to confirm that this was a reasonable kind of size for a ship. Or they might come back and say, no, it's not you can't get all that on that displacement. You're going to have to make it bigger if you want all that, or you're going to have to cut something if you want the displacement. Now, the Navy's naval architects tended to be more optimistic than the shipbuilding industry's naval architects. So what you had was a system where the Navy's guys were saying, yeah, I think we can do that. And the shipbuilding industry's guys were saying, no, we can't do that. And so this fed into the Navy's distrust of the shipbuilding industry. Our guys say we can do it. You say we can't. So perhaps to sort of get rid of the Navy's overinflated expectations, in 1938, the shipbuilding industry pulled off a bureaucratic coup and managed to extract the Navy's design team from the Navy and take it over. Oh, good. Now we don't have to worry about that anymore. They're not going to be giving them big ideas about what we can do. But of course, the Navy managed to rebuild its group, although it was never quite as I don't think it was ever quite as influential again, at least not for a while. Now, having gotten the Navy's requirements, the shipbuilding industry would assign the design a project number. So, you see these Soviet ships, Project 24, Project 67, whatever. That's where that came from. That was the shipbuilding industry's tracking number for the design. They would turn this over to one of these design bureaus with naval architects, marine engineers, draftsmen, and supporting staff. In 1930, there were only 2 construction bureaus, one for surface warships, one for submarines. There were also others for civilian vessels, but that's different. But as the years passed, the system got more elaborate. There were more bureaus were created, and they began to specialize. So by the eve of the war, this is what you had in place. You had a design bureau for battleships, another for cruisers, another for destroyers, another for smaller warships, and one for submarines. And then there were other design bureaus that handled things like torpedo boats and other, what you might call minor warships. The interesting thing about these groups was the size of them. That's a lot of people working. I mean, I couldn't get numbers for these 2, but you've got very large organizations dealing with this stuff. Now, there was a second pathway in warship design. Now, here we have an arrested rocket designer, Sergei Korolev, who I mentioned earlier. I couldn't find a picture of an arrested naval constructor. And so we have to we just take a rocket constructor. Now, This second pathway was the secret police, better known to many as the NKVD. Following the arrests of many of the bourgeois specialists around 1930, these guys were all shipped off, and the idea arose of putting them to use. I mean, these guys have expertise. We don't trust them, but maybe we can get some mileage out of them. So they set up special construction bureaus. And there were construction bureaus for all kinds of things, artillery and chemical weapons and things, all kinds of things. They were set up and they were called shiragas or shirashkas. Now, this is a slang term for an untrustworthy, unreliable enterprise or organization. And this was dreamed up by the guys who were incarcerated in these places. Many of these shirashkas were actually shut down in 1933-34 because they weren't producing much. But then you get to 1937 and the big purges. Thousands of engineers, thousands of scientists and specialists were all swept up. And the system of these special design bureaus, these sharashkas, was greatly expanded. The most famous inmate of these was Andrei Tupolev, the aircraft designer. He was under arrest from 1937 to 41, and he worked in one of these special design bureaus. And what he did, among other things, was he rescued Korolev, who had been sent off to Kolyma, a labor camp, where he lost all his teeth due to scurvy. He had various and sundry bodily injuries. So he rescued him because he knew of his abilities and wanted to get him to work for his design bureau. And he had enough pull, even though he was incarcerated, to pull it, to get that to happen. Now, there were about I've been able to identify 3 design bureaus and prison design bureaus that were staffed with naval architects or with other naval-related things. OKB-5, which designed small combatants and border patrol craft for the NKVD. OKB-172, which designed naval gun mountings. And OKB-196, which was involved mostly, but not exclusively, in submarine design. Now, they were part of the Gulag system, but the conditions there were pretty good certainly compared to the labor camps. One of the engineers there wrote, in the sharashkas, they address you by your name and patronymic. That's a polite form of address in Russian, Ivan Ivanovich. They feed you decently, better than many eat on the outside. You work in warmth and sleep on a straw mattress with a sheet. For some of the guys who had come directly from the camps, this was great. But these guys were still in prison, and they were cut off from the outside world and their families. Now, the sharashkas produced several designs for submarines, torpedo boats, and other vessels like that. And just before the Second World War, OKB-196 was producing a series of designs for a small cruiser, kind of like the Atlantis, very similar to the Atlantic class. But the war interrupted that, and that whole series of projects was canceled. Or they had more important things to do than worry about small cruiser designs. So here's another wonderful painting. You got Stalin in the middle there, looking at the design of the Kirov class cruisers. So the question is, what was it like to actually be a constructor called before one of these defense committee meetings to talk about the design of a new ship? We get a few glimpses of this from the memoir literature and from diaries. The designers, who all worked in Leningrad, they would be called away from their desks, put aboard the Red Arrow overnight train to Moscow, and late the next day, they would come to the Kremlin. Stalin was a night owl. He didn't start working until the afternoon. The meetings didn't start until the evenings, and they often ran into the next day. So decrees were often dated, like July 6th, 7th, because the meeting had begun on one day, ended on the next. So in other words, the sunlight pouring through these windows, that's artistic license. It wasn't like that. It would have been dark. And you can see, here's a guy looking at the battleship plans or something. So one of the guys, one constructor, Boris Zubov, he's described a meeting about the Project 23 battleship that took place on February 27th, 1938. And here's what he said about it. The group was put in a reception room for a while. And here he goes. The assembled group talked animatedly, drank strong sweet tea with lemon, and ate tasty slices of bread and butter, which lay on several metal trays and hillocks. Not more than half an hour had passed when we were all invited into the Oval Hall. The demonstration drawings of the Project 23 technical design were already there, as was the 1/100 scale model, almost 3 meters long. And that's a photo of that model, which still exists. Behind a long table sat the leaders of the country, whom we all knew so well, the members of the Defense Committee, headed by the chair of the meeting, Vyacheslav Mikhailovich Molotov. Now, although Molotov was the chairman of the Defense Committee, no one was in any doubt about who it was who really made the decisions. Stalin sat somewhere off to the side in an armchair, smoking his ever-present pipe. And also there was Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the NKVD. And Zubov noted during the meeting that every 10 minutes, a courier came to him and handed him a packet. He would open it and sign something. And these were probably arrest orders. But there sat Yezhov, sending people off to jail or to death. Now, at this particular meeting, the representatives of the shipbuilding industry spoke first, giving verbal reports on the progress of the design work. The Navy men then had their chance. They objected to the elimination of two twin turrets for 100mm anti-aircraft guns, a change that was made by the shipbuilding industry because of a problem with the design's trim. The shipbuilders were then given an opportunity to rebut the Navy's concerns. And they said, if we add the turrets back in, the redesign work is going to extend, it's going to delay the completion of the battleship design. So Stalin follows the course of these discussions, and we go back to Zubov's report. During the meeting, he sometimes interrupted, walking up to the drawings and the battleship model, asking during a report for more information. At the end of the discussion, Stalin stood up from his armchair, walked around the hall, summing things up, calmly and persuasively stating his thoughts on the issues raised during the discussion. Regarding the Navy's demand for additional turrets, he proposed to the People's Commissar of the Navy that this question be resolved in 2 months. So we just added 2 months to the design process. Now, this trim problem, by the way, was probably the result of a design error, quite possibly a miscalculation of the weights, leading to the ship being deeper at the stern than they wanted it to be, was the ultimate issue. There's another meeting that was kind of fun that we have a report on, and that involved the Stalingrad class heavy cruisers. Now, in Soviet parlance, heavy cruiser meant battle cruiser. These ships were going to have 12-inch guns. So another meeting comes up. In his memoirs, Admiral Kuznetsov said that Stalin had a special, difficult to explain passion for heavy cruisers, which were, again, battle cruisers. Before the war, this passion had led to the design and construction of the Kronstadt class, which were still under construction when the war began and so were canceled. But after the war, Stalin again insisted that the Navy build battle cruisers like this, even though the Navy didn't want them. These were Stalin's baby. So the Navy produced, the shipbuilding industry produced a 40,000-ton design with a speed of 32 knots, which was approved. So they began work, getting the more detailed design work done. Then suddenly at a meeting, when this design is completed, they're presenting it to the Defense Committee again. Stalin says suddenly, no, it's got to go 35 knots. That's a 3-knot increase in speed. That's pretty tough to do. Moreover, he wants the displacement reduced. So it's supposed to go faster with more powerful machinery on a smaller displacement. Now, the designers managed to pull this off. This was the result. What they did was they increased the size of the propulsion plant, which squeezed out some of the anti-aircraft guns. They reduced the ammunition outfit, and they had to alter other features. This design then came up for review on the 4th of March, 1950. Vyacheslav Malyshev, the head of the shipbuilding industry, in his diary described the events that happened. Mostly Stalin's comments, because what other people said was not important. So the Navy was unhappy with the sacrifices the shipbuilders had made in order to squeeze 35 knots out of this design. And when the Navy questioned the need for a 35-knot speed, Stalin said, "It is necessary to increase the speed to 32 knots and create a cruiser that will cause panic among the enemy's light cruisers. Disperse and destroy them. This cruiser must fly like a swallow. It must be a pirate, a real bandit." So at this time, the Soviets were worried about Anglo-American carrier groups being able to approach the Soviet Union and use atomic weapons on Soviet coastal installations. So I guess as far as I can figure out, Stalin's idea was, well, maybe I can't get to the carriers directly, but if I can screw up their screening forces, they'll be forced to retreat. That's the only logic I can see in this idea of, destroying the enemy's light cruisers. If anybody has a better idea, talk to me afterwards, because I'd welcome it. Now, what the upshot of this was that the enemy would be fought relatively close to Soviet coasts. So here's another little bit from the diary. Comrade Stalin also ordered the number of shells for both the main battery and the anti-aircraft battery reduced. And when the Navy men began to raise objections and pointed out that the ammunition outfit of American and English ships was greater, Comrade Stalin said, "You cannot blindly copy the Americans and English. They face different conditions. Their ships travel far over the ocean, out of touch with their bases. We are not considering conducting oceanic battles, but instead will fight close to our own shores, so we do not need a large ammunition supply for the ship." Okay. So having disposed of these issues, Stalin then dismissed the admiral's complaints about the reduced anti-aircraft armament. Comrade Stalin said it was foolish to put 130mm anti-aircraft guns on the ship, these having a ceiling of 16 kilometers. Who would bomb from such a site? The enemy will bomb the ship from a height of 1,500, 1,000, or 500 meters. Consequently, only light anti-aircraft guns are needed. So Stalin had rejected every one of the Navy's complaints, and his logic is open to question. How would the Soviet battle cruisers get close enough to the American light cruisers to take them out when they were covered by aircraft? Yeah, there's a problem here, dude. Did you really think that Western aircraft would be flying in at 500 meters to attack them when guided weapons were coming into play? Seems kind of loony. His ideas of naval strategy and tactics seem more suited to the 30s than to 1950. Nevertheless, the design was improved, construction began at a very high priority, almost like the priority of the atomic bomb project in a lot of ways. But they were still far from complete when Stalin died in March '53, and the ships were immediately canceled by his successors. So now, well, we've talked about the roles of Stalin, the Navy, the shipbuilding industry, and the constructors in designing the ships. How good were the ships? That's the bottom line. Overall, the answer is not very good. There were many reasons for this, but the most important reason was that everybody in the process was simply inexperienced at what they were doing. To start with, almost every surface ship built before the war came in well overweight, which reduces stability, reduces your buoyancy, and all kinds of good things happen. Now, some of this was due to design errors. Some of it was due to the fact that the stuff supplied by other industries came in overweight, almost always came in higher than what had been predicted. Other problems were the result of poor workmanship in the shipyards and poor weight control management in the shipyards, especially at the new yard in Komsomolsk in the Far East. As for the quality of the ships, we can start with some remarks by an American naval officer, Commander Kemp Tolley, who had the opportunity to inspect the modern destroyer Razumny, this one here, in Polyarnoi during the Second World War. In his report, he noted that the general impression of the ship gained, built in 1937, was inferior in every respect to a contemporary American vessel. Her effectiveness in battle would be not greater than that of a World War I type US destroyer. Her design is not good. Even the commander of the Soviet Northern Fleet, Admiral Arseny Golovko, admitted that the newly built destroyers of this class were inferior in seakeeping to the World War I era Novik class ships that were smaller. In fact, there was one case where some men were rescued off one of these ships by Novik class ships because of the weather conditions. Now, during the war, Soviet cruisers and destroyers also displayed a sort of alarming feature. their bow or their stern would fall off when subjected to action damage. This is the cruiser Maxim Gorky, part of the Baltic Fleet, where she struck a mine during the opening days of the war. And as you can see, her bow is gone. Her sister in the Black Sea, the Molotov, had her stern blown off by a torpedo. The modern destroyers Gnievny, Bezposhadny, Statny, and Sposobny all lost their bows due to action damage, and all at about the same place. So this was, it's a particular problem. The modern destroyer Sokrushitelny lost her stern, lost her bow when it was torn away in a gale. Or wait, I'm sorry. She lost her stern. I'm sorry about that. In another storm, her sister ship Gromky limped back to harbor with her bow attached to the rest of the ship only by the keel. The rest of the structure was gone. The problem was that the Soviets had used longitudinal framing amidships, and then fore and aft they'd used transverse framing. And the juncture between these framing systems had not been as well designed. D.K. Brown, famous British naval architect, said that when you do this, it requires very careful design to avoid stress concentrations. And just by the way the damage happened to these ships, they triggered that particular flaw. As for the submarines, this is the submarine Rodovolets, which I got to visit in 2002. The submarines were very noisy. According to one Soviet submarine constructor, they could be heard at 5 to 6 times the distance of the S-class boats designed by the Dutch IDS firm with German technology. And despite the superiority of the S-class, other Soviet submarines continued to be built to older designs, older Soviet designs or updated Soviet designs, because the building techniques required by the S-class were beyond the capabilities of some of the shipyards. So they had to continue building older, inferior designs, basically just to keep up with the number of ships they wanted to build, because it was always very important in the Soviet Union, to build to plan. We're supposed to build X number of submarines. We will build X number of submarines, no matter how crappy they are. Now, this is a rather fuzzy still from a Soviet 1939 film, Moriaki, the Sailors. In it, an unnamed European power attacks the USSR in the Black Sea, and things are looking really bleak for the Red Navy. There's some wonderful footage there of Soviet guns being fired and so forth. But then, like the cavalry charging over the hill, this long line of Soviet battleships suddenly appears and saves the day, blasting the capitalists one broadside after another. It's really wonderful. But in reality, of course, there was no Soviet battle fleet. Stalin's attempt to build a powerful navy was thwarted by many factors. Among them, an inadequate number of skilled designers and engineers, industrial backwardness, and harmful, not to say deadly, government interference. But I believe there was a single underlying factor pretty much underneath all these things, and that was Stalin's inability to appreciate the complexity of warship design and construction. In July 1931, he had declared his plans for the Navy, and he said he did not exclude the possibility that in 5 years we will build battleships. Now, this was before they built a single destroyer. This time frame was far too optimistic. Mastering the manufacture of heavy gun mountings, heavy face-hardened armor, and powerful propulsion plants were going to be difficult enough problems. But combining all of these things into an effective warship, that was an even more difficult problem. That involved thousands of technical details. A great deal of information had been acquired from foreign shipbuilders. Soviet naval constructors, nevertheless, still had much to learn about how to combine all these things into a good warship. Stalin's dream of a great navy was just that, a dream. And that dream died with him. When Nikita Khrushchev eventually emerged as his successor, he'd take the Soviet Navy in an entirely different direction, submarines and missile ships. But that's another story. So thank you for your attention. And do you have any questions? That's our dog. I figured I'd need something a little light at the end. How much time have I got, Sam?
Well, we've got 3 questions. That'll be it.
Okay, yes, sir.
In regards to the Pacific Fleet for the Soviet Union, Did they ever consider underway replenishment for their ships? And if so, what kind of facilities did they put on those ships?
Oh, okay, that's fine. That's fine. I don't think they, under Stalin, they were not planning long-range operations, even in the Pacific. They were building a navy for relatively close-range operations. So I don't think underway replenishment was anywhere in their thinking at that time. Later on, of course, it became a factor, but at the era that I'm talking about today, it wasn't really a factor at all. Okay, yes, sir.
Well, thank you so much, sir. As someone, as a student of political science, I find this really fascinating to hear about the Soviet government interference. And I've done some research and read about, in terms of what Red Army doctrine, how certain ideas had to be revolutionary enough to be implemented, and sort of the role party ideology would play in influencing somewhat detrimentally the way they actually function.
Right.
I'm curious, were there some parallels when you think Red Army doctrine, the way they actually would plan, both I see someone design how they did that, or maybe they can speak about more details of the actual government interference and how it was felt in these ways.
That's a huge question, and rather than give a long and detailed answer, the real brief summary is that yes, especially in the 1920s and the early 1930s, you had what was called the young school of Red commanders. They were called commanders trained under the Soviets, and they were a big believer in mosquito warfare, torpedo boats, aviation submarines, what they called unblockadable weapons. The older school, which never called itself the old school, was more, battleship, heavy ship, although they didn't discount the possibilities of submarines. And this was used in the ideological boxing match for a long time, and a lot of the old school guys got purged. But the funny thing was that throughout the whole period, 1931, when I made that quote about building battleships in 5 years, that was at the height of the period of getting rid of the guys who said they needed battleships. So Stalin could say one thing, but be doing something else. He was purging the guys who wanted the ships that he wanted. So you have to be careful with ideology in the Stalin era, because he was a tactician. He would cut and do whatever he needed to get where he wanted to go, and only he knew where he wanted to get, and everybody else was sort of like, oh crap, I guess wrong. And so now I'm off to the gulags. There's a couple of very good books by a guy named Herrick that you can look at if you want to plunge into that more deeply. Yes, sir.
Do you have any insight into why it was being operated Soviets? And even that built one question.
There was a lot going on. They wanted something that the other had. The Italians wanted grain, they wanted oil, especially when the embargo set in after the Ethiopian invasion. The Soviets wanted technology in all fields, from automobile design and construction, all the way to military and naval equipment. So it was a bargaining process, and they were, they were compatible in other ways, even though the systems were theoretically antithetical. The only real breakdown came during the Spanish Civil War, when they were on opposite sides, and Italian submarines were attacking Soviet freighters. But even that was patched up pretty quickly once that war had sort of petered out. So it was mutual interest. It wasn't necessarily mutual love. And there was maybe one more.
After the war, they were awarded the Graf Zeppelin aircraft carrier, and yet it doesn't seem like that really influenced their design bureaus or their thinking towards aircraft carriers.
Stalin wasn't interested in aircraft carriers. The Navy kept proposing aircraft carriers, and Stalin said, no, they're too complex. They require too much training, too much effort. We're not going to go that route. His ideas always seemed to be concentrated on operations relatively close to Soviet coasts, where the air cover would be provided by land-based aircraft, which I believe is a great fallacy, because the land-based aircraft are never there when you need them. But that was Stalin's thinking, and so that was it.